Opening the center, white immediately stakes a claim for central control and prepares development. Immediately confronting the central pawn establishes a solid, symmetrical pawn structure, aiming for equality from the outset. Challenging the center's dominance. This pawn thrust immediately aims to disrupt black's d5 stronghold and seize territorial advantage. On the queenside, black solidifies the center, preparing a robust pawn structure that discourages immediate central breakthroughs by white. Developing the knight to f3 solidifies control of the center while preparing for queenside expansion and castling. Developing the knight to f6 naturally contests the center and prepares castling. A solid and versatile response to the Slav. Solidifying central influence. This knight prepares to eye the queenside and potentially support a pawn advance. Preparing the b5 push. This quiet maneuver aims to gain queenside space and potentially disrupt white's central control. Immediately solidifying queenside space aims to restrict black's queenside expansion and potentially prepare for a future b4 push. Preparing to fianchetto the bishop. g6 aims to solidify the queenside defense and potentially launch a kingside pawn storm. Developing the bishop to f4 aims to control the d6-h2 diagonal and prepare for queenside castling, while also potentially pressuring black's d5 pawn if it becomes undefended. Developing the bishop to g7 completes black's fianchetto, creating a formidable diagonal targeting white's queenside and preparing to castle, solidifying the king's position while maintaining flexibility for future pawn pushes like e5. Solidifying the center and preparing a kingside fianchetto. This move neatly tucks the pawn away, freeing the bishop and aiming to keep the central pawns protected while the queenside develops. Safely tucking the king away is the immediate priority, freeing up the pieces and preparing for future central operations. The immediate challenge now becomes coordinating the queenside and challenging white's growing influence on the queenside. Solidifying the center and preparing to connect the rooks. The bishop retreats to a safer square, avoiding potential tactical skirmishes while maintaining defensive pressure on the dark squares. Challenging white's central pawn structure. Black immediately creates dynamic possibilities and potential pawn breaks, aiming to disrupt white's harmonious development. Capturing the pawn on c5 immediately resolves the central tension, opening lines and inviting rapid piece development for white, though it momentarily concedes space in the center. Challenging the pawn's advanced position. Black immediately seeks to exploit the open diagonal created by white's capture, aiming to disrupt white's queenside structure and potentially harass the king if it remains in the center too long. Prioritizing king's safety. White tucks their monarch away, reinforcing the central pawn structure and preparing to develop the remaining pieces with tempo, all while keeping an eye on black's potentially ambitious queen. Accepting the gambit and opening lines might seem tempting, but it grants white's bishop invaluable diagonals. Consider how the central tension is now somewhat diffused, potentially easing black's development. This liberation of the queen from its pawn shelter could lead to interesting skirmishes. But be mindful of the king's safety as the game progresses. Unleashing a knight to e5 immediately disrupts black's central control and threatens to pry open the queenside pawn structure, potentially creating weaknesses around the castled king. Reclaiming the pawn with the queen. A bold reassertion of central presence immediately ignites a sharp positional struggle, forcing white to address the unexpected threat to their centralized knight and opening up fascinating counterplay possibilities down the now exposed c-file. Exploiting the unprotected pawn on c4, white decisively centralizes their knight, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially create attacking avenues. Finally, black addresses the misplaced queen, rerouting it from its adventurous excursion to a more central, defensible post, while simultaneously preparing to challenge white's central pawn mass and potentially unblock the bishop on c8. This is a sound repositioning aimed at restoring equilibrium, aggressively seizing space on the queenside. This pawn thrust aims to cramp black's queenside operations and create outpost potential for white's pieces, though it does create a potential weakness on b5 that black might try to exploit. Unyielding against the encroaching queenside pawns, black now seeks to improve the coordination of their minor pieces and brace for potential tactical skirmishes by centralizing the bishop and preparing to challenge white's pawn wall on the queenside. Initiating a calculated flank assault, this knight aggressively occupies the 5th rank, aiming to disrupt black's central pawn structure and create potential weaknesses around the queen's bishop. Emerging from a slightly cramped position, the queen repositions to a more active square, aiming to challenge white's control of the queenside and potentially create counterplay against the isolated d4 pawn. Unleashing a knight to b6, white boldly challenges the queenside structure, aiming to disrupt black's coordinated pieces and potentially create weaknesses around the queen. This aggressive positioning might force concessions or lead to a favorable exchange for white, as the knight now eyes squares like c7 and d7, disrupting black's intended piece development and control over key central diagonals. Black anchors the rook, an important step in establishing centralized piece activity and preparing to contest the open d-file, a critical artery for potential future pawn advances or direct assault. Embracing the initiative, white targets the isolated pawn on c4, a key weakness in black's setup, aiming to disrupt black's coordination and potentially secure a material advantage or create lasting positional pressure. This aggressive knight jump aims to disrupt white's coordinated pieces and potentially create tactical opportunities, while simultaneously challenging the bishop on e2 and the pawn structure. Shattering the queenside bind and opening the a-file. This capture forces a re-evaluation of black's pawn structure and could lead to increased activity for white's rooks. Black boldly reclaims central space, sacrificing a pawn momentarily to activate the rook and establish it on the open d-file, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially exploit the slightly exposed white king. Suddenly, the queens disappear from the board, initiating an endgame where the pawn structure on the queenside becomes a primary focus for white, potentially creating a passed pawn with the advanced a-pawn if black isn't careful about its protection. Black's recapture with the knight on b4 definitively transitions the game into an endgame where white's queenside majority is neutralized, and the knight now aims to disrupt white's pawn structure. Securing the central open file with the rook is a crucial step toward asserting dominance in the middle game, preparing for potential pawn pushes and concentrating forces against black's somewhat passive setup. Black's rook slides to the open file, a bold declaration for central influence and a challenge to white's established pawn structure, aiming to disrupt white's coordinated pieces and potentially prepare a more active role for its queen on the queenside. Consolidating the queenside pawn structure. This move aims to solidify white's foothold while preparing for a potential central pawn advance later, seeking to restrict black's piece mobility and create a more defensible pawn chain. Black's knight, liberated from its pawn's blockade, now eyes the central squares, hinting at a potential rearrangement that could unsettle white's pawn structure. Preparing to assert control over the d-file and challenge black's rook activity. This maneuver clears the way for the bishop to actively participate in the central struggle. Black's rook now establishes a precarious outpost on the 5th rank, aiming to disrupt White's queenside structure and potentially probe for weaknesses on the b-file. Though it simultaneously leaves the knight on b4 somewhat exposed to future pressure. Opening the d-file with the rook immediately injects tension, challenging Black's potentially awkward queen placement and eyeing the rook on d8, aiming to exploit any hesitation in its retreat. Reclaiming central influence and preparing for an active rook lift forms the core of this maneuver, aiming to dislodge the white knight and create play on the open d-file. Recognizing the stalemate in central pawn structure, White opts to consolidate the rook position, aiming for better coordination along the d-file rather than immediately forcing the issue. This thoughtful repositioning, though seemingly passive, aims to prepare a more potent future attack or defense by ensuring the rook on d1 is not isolated, and can support advances or retreats with greater flexibility. Aha! The knight, having been chased to the edge and then back into the fray, now finds itself in a familiar predicament, a dance of evasion and redirection. Observe how Black aims to reposition this crucial piece to a square where it can exert more influence, perhaps targeting White's kingside or reinforcing the central structure. This maneuver isn't just about the knight's immediate safety. It's a subtle attempt to disrupt White's carefully constructed pawn chain and potentially open up lines for future operations. Consider the long-term implications of this knight's journey. Where might it ultimately land to pose the greatest threat? Reasserting control over the vital central files. The rook's repositioning aims to prevent Black from establishing a commanding outpost on d3 or reinforcing their knight's mobility. Reclaiming space and repositioning the bishop to a more active diagonal. This maneuver aims to untangle the pieces and prepare for central play. Liberating the bishop from its pinned status initiates a bold structural assertion, aiming to disrupt Black's burgeoning queenside influence and potentially open lines for an assault. Preparing a repositioning of the bishop to an active diagonal. This knight is now invited to an aggressive outpost, aiming to disrupt White's pawn structure and create tactical opportunities by leveraging the open c-file, which could soon become a pathway for attack if White is not vigilant. 26. e5 boldly asserts central dominion, seeking to pry open lines for White's pieces and restrict Black's active knights. This strategic retreat of the rook from the b-file re-establishes a more resilient pawn structure for Black, fortifying the d5 square and preparing to contest the newly opened e-file, potentially forcing White into a passive defense of their advanced e5 pawn. Clearing the way for the rook to occupy the crucial c-file creates immediate pressure on Black's queenside pawns and offers a chance to exploit the slightly exposed king. Rebuilding pawn structure after the exchange creates an isolated queen's pawn and slightly passive bishop placement. Reclaiming the central file after a pawn sacrifice. White aims to exert pressure on Black's somewhat exposed queen's rook, bolstering the king's safety against potential threats along the light squares now becomes a priority as Black prepares to solidify their defensive structure. Initiating a pawn storm on the kingside, White aims to pry open lines and potentially target Black's king, which currently enjoys some pawn cover but might become exposed as the game progresses and central tension dissipates. Seizing an open file immediately elevates Black's pressure, unlocking a crucial diagonal and threatening to trap the enemy rook on b3. This maneuver brilliantly exposes weaknesses in Black's pawn structure and disrupts their defensive setup. A bold maneuver, embracing the open files for potential counterplay, yet sacrificing significant pawn structure for it. Unleashing a decisive battery down the open file. This aggressive thrust aims to shatter the defensive shield around Black's king, initiating a tactical storm that promises swift resolution. The immediate capture of the rook with the king initiates a decisive exchange, simplifying the position towards a likely endgame and relinquishing the initiative for Black in the center. Consolidating the rook advantage after the forced exchange simplifies the material balance, steering toward a winning endgame where the extra pawn will be decisive thanks to the pawn majority on the queenside and the activity of the remaining rook. Securing the king's safety is paramount as the board simplifies, creating a more open environment where enemy incursions become more dangerous. Initiating an aggressive pawn thrust with the knight, nd7** aims to disrupt Black's pawn structure and potentially create weaknesses around the king. This aggressive maneuver challenges the newly arrived rook and forces Black to make a reactive decision, potentially sacrificing material or allowing White to gain further positional advantages. The knight's strong outpost at d7 exerts pressure on multiple squares and restricts Black's piece mobility, signaling a shift towards a more dynamic phase of the game. Accepting the rook sacrifice re-establishes material equality, but the pawns on the kingside, now doubled after the pawn grab, create a lasting weakness that the advanced rook will ruthlessly exploit. The rook now commands the now open 7th rank, a powerful outpost that will severely restrict Black's bishop and potentially create mating threats against the exposed king. Reclaiming material in this endgame transition, Black recaptures the pawn, but at the cost of allowing White's rook to dominate the d-file and potentially threaten the king's safety down the road. Strikes a decisive blow, severing the bishop's defensive network and opening the floodgates towards the enemy monarch. Reclaiming the pawn and stabilizing the central structure provides Black with a much-needed respite and a more solid foundation after a period of tactical exchanges. Unleashing the rook to a central outpost, White immediately threatens to sever Black's pawn chain and potentially infiltrate the 7th rank, forcing a critical decision on how to defend the vulnerable king. This capture immediately frees Black's rook, aiming to activate it on the open file and potentially pressure White's isolated pawn on a. Seizing the open file immediately with the rook opens up a clear path to advance the passed pawn, aiming for a swift queenside majority. A quiet moment to regroup the king, preparing to contest the open files and solidify the remaining pawn structure against White's encroaching pieces. The rook's journey to the 7th rank, after a strategic pawn sacrifice, now aims to exploit the newly opened h-file and create pressure on the weakened Black king. A pawn sacrifice to open a path for the rook, aiming to disrupt the opponent's pawn structure and potentially activate the rook on the open c-file. The king ventures out, initiating a risky trek towards the center, aiming to activate its defensive and offensive potential in what remains of this simplified position. Finally, a pawn ventures forward, potentially creating a refuge for the monarch or opening a path for counterplay. Gearing up for a king march, this maneuver finally unifies the white monarch with its active pieces. The king's central expedition, while aiming to disrupt White's pawns, exposes it to the bishop's diagonal pressure and the rook's potential outpost on the 7th rank. It would have been wiser to maintain defensive solidity behind the pawn shield and coordinate pieces for a more measured advance. Consolidating the king's presence in the center now, aiming to leverage its newfound activity in the simplified landscape and potentially restrict the opponent's rook from exploiting open files. The king ventures back into the fray, a risky but potentially rewarding repositioning to aid the pawn push and defend against potential future checks. Solidifying the pawn chain, This quiet maneuver prepares to activate the king and potentially launch a central pawn push, aiming to gain more breathing room and restrict black's already limited mobility. Opening up the queenside to activate the rook and create potential pawn breakthroughs. Unleashing pawns on the kingside now becomes the pressing order of business, aiming to pry open avenues of attack against the enemy monarch, even at the cost of some structural integrity. The king embarks on a precarious journey, aiming to connect with its pawn structure, but risks becoming isolated on the queenside as white's rook prowls actively. The king ventures into the fray, a bold march toward the center to reclaim the initiative and support the advancing pawns in this shifting landscape. A daring attempt to disrupt white's king march by anchoring the rook to the first rank, hoping to create counterplay or force a concession. Capturing the pawn offers a slight space advantage on the kingside, aiming to create potential passed pawns later, but it does open up black's rook slightly more on the 7th rank. The capture on h5 initiates an endgame where the doubled pawns on the h-file present a significant long-term structural weakness for black, despite the immediate material parity. The rook now takes up a menacing position, preparing to cut off the black king from any further queenside support. The rook now occupies the open file, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially infiltrate the kingside, targeting the rook's advanced position. This aggressive push aims to disrupt black's coordination and potentially trap the piece, asserting dominance over the queenside and clearing a path for the king to become more active in the ensuing exchanges. Hoping to lure the king into a vulnerable square, black offers a check, a desperate attempt to disrupt white's well-established pawn structure and gain some much-needed counterplay in this now open position. This king relocation is crucial for supporting the pawn push, aiming to establish a safer haven and potentially orchestrate a pawn storm on the kingside. The black king, having shed its defensive pawn shield, now ventures into open territory, seeking a safe haven from the relentless pressure of white's rooks. The rook boldly penetrates the defensive setup, aiming to mop up the weakened pawns and solidify its newfound space. Capturing the pawn with the rook opens up a tantalizing possibility for perpetual check, forcing white to carefully consider their next steps to avoid a draw, or perhaps offering a tricky gambit for more active play. Asserting queenside dominion, the rook solidifies its dominion over the open file, creating an unassailable outpost and preparing to exert pressure on the isolated passed pawn. Pushing the pawn here aims to create a passed pawn and potentially tie down white's rook, but it opens lines towards black's king. Securing the isolated pawn on a4 forces black's rook to defend it, while white's king can now step closer to the center. The king's journey to relative safety now seems like the priority, venturing further down the board to seek shelter on the kingside and avoid the remaining rooks. Probing along the 7th rank. Seizing the open file with the king is paramount now, aiming to participate actively in the endgame skirmishes and restrict black's rook. A final push to solidify the pawn structure and prepare for a more active rook. The king embarks on a daring march, venturing into enemy territory to support the advancing pawns and seek out weaknesses. This desperate pawn push, attempting to create a passed pawn out of thin air, opens up the king to further exposure and ultimately leads to a lost endgame. The king bravely advances, abandoning its shield of pawns to escort the rook into the fray and seek a mating net for the opponent's monarch. Pushing the f-pawn now opens a critical defensive pathway for the king, creating a vital escape square and challenging white's forward pawn advances. Protecting the king from further pawn infiltration becomes paramount. securing the monarch's sanctuary behind the newly reinforced pawn wall. Opening up the king for activity is paramount now, as the passed pawn on A must be supported. The king cautiously advances, seeking safety behind its pawn wall as the rook eyes the vulnerable A file. Pivoting the king towards the queenside initiates a daring maneuver, seeking active participation in the unfolding struggle and potentially unsettling white's already established pawn structure. A subtle repositioning of the monarch, seeking safer territory away from the encroaching pawns and the active enemy pieces. A prudent step in this complex endgame. Challenging the isolated pawn on A with the rook, aiming to create counterplay and potentially disrupt white's kingside pawn structure. Exploiting the open file to disrupt black's pawn structure. Black's pawn push on the queenside aims to gain space and potentially create a passed pawn, though it also exposes the king slightly and may prove difficult to support. Seizing the open file is paramount now, aiming to push that pawn and create a passed threat. The rook penetrates, aiming to harass the enemy king, but it might be stepping into a trap where the white monarch can find refuge and regroup. The king's detour to h3 offers a slight reprieve from potential checks along the third rank, simultaneously preparing to support the advancing A pawn. The rook now becomes an unstoppable force, marching unopposed to the promotion square. Securing the advanced pawn is paramount, preventing black's counterplay and consolidating white's advantage. Pressing the pawn to b2 sacrifices tempo and offers no real attacking potential. Instead, a more robust defense of the king would involve repositioning the rook to a more active square.